Hey folks, my name is Ms. Midha, and today we're going to be focusing on the following question. How do we identify a normal distribution over a data set? So we're going to be looking at a particular situation that contains a giant set of data, and we're going to just sort of remind ourselves how to summarize the data into a histogram, and then use that histogram to answer some questions. So here goes. All right, here's our situation. A publisher takes submissions for short stories to include in a book. 200 stories are submitted, but the publisher needs to be aware of how long each story is. The way the publisher will put together the collection of stories, a page typically contains 200 words. The mean number of words for each story is 2,600, and the standard deviation is 400 words. So here you have all of that data, right? This is the collection of 200 stories, and it's listing how many words are in each of those stories. Now, in a previous video, I explained how to actually summarize this data into a histogram, and we learned how to create that histogram on Desmos. So if you're not sure how to do that, I do encourage you to go to that video from before and learn how to actually create a histogram using Desmos. In this video, we're going to use the histogram that was created to actually answer some questions. So again, this is our data set. This data set was summarized into a histogram that looks something like this. And again, if you're not sure how this was created, do go back to the previous video to see the actual procedure on creating this histogram. For now, we're going to focus on this histogram. And like I said before, answer some questions. So here we go. All right, these are our first set of questions. What proportion of the total area is represented by the bar for stories that contain between 2,000 and 2,200 words? The second question is asking, what proportion of stories in this group contain between 2,000 and 2,200 words? And then finally, how does the proportion of the area you calculated relate to the proportion of stories in the group that contain between 2,000 and 2,000 words? So go ahead and pause the video and take as long as you need to see if you can answer these questions. Once you think you have the answers to these questions, unpause the video and we will review. All right, so what proportion of the total area is represented by the bar for stories that contain between 2,000 and 2,200 words? All right, well, let's think this through. We know that the entire area, the total area, consists of bars that are 200 wide, that would be 200 tall when stacked. So what is the total area then? Well, what I would do is I would take that number 200, right? Again, bars that are 200 wide, and I would times it by 200. 200 wide, those bars, that would be 200 tall when stacked. That's going to give me 40,000. So if I'm looking for the proportion of the total area that's represented by the bar for stories that contain between 2,000 and 2,200, well, I would take that number that I figured out from before, right, that 3,600, that area, and I would divide that by 40,000. This is going to give me 0.09. Okay, now what proportion of stories in this group contain between 2,000 and 2,200 words? Well, how do I do that one? Okay, well, I know that there are 18 stories in this group, right? We counted those before and we could see it on our histogram as well. And we know that there are 18 stories in that group and 200 stories total. Well, when we do 18 divided by 200, we actually get 0.09 again. So how does the proportion of the area that we calculated relate to the proportion of stories? It's actually the same, right? It's actually the same. And if we think about why that's the same value, right? Why is that the same value? Well, where did the area come from? Right? The area came from essentially 18 times 200 over 200 times 200. And that's the same thing as 18 over 200. So that's why it makes sense that these are the same. All right, we're going to look at 3 more questions. And these have to do with standard deviation. So what proportion of stories in this group are within 1 standard deviation of the mean number of words? What proportion of stories are in this group are within 2 standard deviations of the mean number of words? And what proportion of stories in this group are within 1 standard deviation of 2,400 words? So just like before, pause the video, take as much time as you need. Once you think you have the answer, unpause, and we'll review. Okay, so a couple of things that we need to make sure we know before we can actually answer these questions. First, what is the mean? Well, the mean number of words for each story is 2,600. All right, that's super important to know because it is asking us about standard deviation of the mean number within 1 and 2 standard deviations of the mean number of words. We also know that the standard deviation is 400 words. Okay. Now, what does it mean when we say within 1 standard deviation or within 2 standard deviations of the mean? Well, if we are saying, let's just look at the first example. If we're saying within 1 standard deviation of the mean, what that really is saying is that we're going to be looking at the intervals from the value of the mean plus or minus 1 standard deviation to the value of the mean. Okay, what did I just say there? Well, if I know that the mean here is 2,600, right? And I'll just go ahead and I'll just make a darker line right there so you can see it on the histogram. I know that my mean is 2,600. And I know that the standard deviation is 400 words. So if I'm looking for the proportion of stories in this group that are within 1 standard deviation of the mean, and I know that my standard deviation is 400, I'm going to be looking at the interval that is 400 more than 2,600 and 400 less than 2,600. Right? Why am I looking at those intervals? Well, the standard deviation is 400 words. So it's the interval from the value of the mean plus 1 time the standard deviation. The value of the mean is 2,600 plus 400. So I'm looking at the interval from 2,600 to 3,000. And I also need to look at the interval from the value of the mean minus 1 time the standard deviation. Again, the mean is 2,600. Minus 400 is 2,200. So that tells us in order to find the answer to that first question, we have to look at the number of stories between 2,200 and 3,000. Okay, so the number of stories between 2,200 and 3,000 words, there are 137 stories. There are 137 stories that fall into that interval. Okay, well, what are we going to do with that? Well, there are 137 stories that fall within the interval between 2,200 and 3,000 words, and there are a total of 200 stories. So I take 137 and I divide it by 200 to get 0.685. All right, for the next question, now it's asking about 200. It's asking about 2 standard deviations. So I'm now going to look at the interval, right? I'm now going to look at the interval from the value of the mean is still 2,600, plus or minus 2 times the standard deviation to the value of the mean, right? So my standard deviation is 400. So if I'm going to be looking at the interval from the mean, again, 2,600, I'm going to add 2 times the standard deviation. So I'm going to add 800. So I'm going to be looking at the interval from 2,600 to 3,400. And besides adding 800 to 2,600, I'm also going to subtract 800 from 2,600. So I'm also going to be looking at the interval between 1,800 and 2,600. Okay, so what does that tell me? Well, if I add those up, I'll actually find out that there are 192 stories. There are 192 stories that fall within those intervals, right? They fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean number of words. So there are 192 stories between 1,800 and 3,400 words. And again, there's 200 total stories. So I do 192 divided by 200, and that's going to give me 0.96. Okay, last question. Now this one is asking about what proportion of stories in this group are within 1 standard deviation of 2,400 words. So instead of looking at the mean, I'm now going to look at where 2,400 words are. So I'll go ahead and highlight that too. Here's my 2,400. And since my standard deviation is 400, I'm going to add 400 to 2400. So I know I'm going to be looking at the interval from 2400 to 2800. And I'm also going to subtract 400 from 2400. So I'm going to also be looking at the interval from 2000 to 2400. Now, how many stories are in those intervals, essentially, the intervals between 2000 and 2800? It turns out there are 125 stories that fall within one standard deviation of 2400 words. And again, it's 125 stories out of 200 stories. That's going to give us 0.625. Okay, so what have we done today? We looked at a giant set of data and we summarized it into a histogram. We learned how to create a histogram on Desmos. And we were also able to figure out how to find essentially the standard deviation, right? We were figuring out the standard deviation, what proportion of stories in the group are within one standard deviation, two standard deviations of our mean, of our given, of the mean number of words, as well as one standard deviation of 2400 words.